book was printed in the year 1659 by a man we only know as the schoolmaster. He never gave us his name, and the little we know comes from his own words. But he lived in the northwestern part of the Netherlands, in a town called Oostzaan. And it was here when the notorious Dutch gentleman of fortunes Claes Compaen came home from the sea. That homecoming was in 1627, the same year the Dutch gave him a pardon. The pardon let him walk free after years of piracy, if he promised to quit the trade. It was part of a plan to draw pirates back into the fold instead of hanging them. Truly, Compaen's fame spread far beyond Oostzaan. He was said to have taken more than 300 ships in his time at sea. He sailed out of places like Salé in Morocco. He also worked with Simon Dunkirker Jr., another notorious Dutchman who turned pirate. But the two fell out, and their quarrel ended in a sea fight. Dunkirker lost and had to flee to the Dutch Republic for safety. And so the schoolmaster wrote a book with a long title about Compaen's life. It came out while Compaen was still alive. The book told of his raids and his wanderings. It said that with only a few ships, he made the seas unsafe, took praises from every coast, and captured ships of many nations. And so in this episode, we'll take a good look at the Dutchman who burned the world as he ravaged the seas and plundered ships left and right. A brief note before we begin. Throughout this episode, we'll pause at times to explain events, places, and customs from Claes Compaen's world. These explanations are meant to guide you, so the larger story makes sense in its full context. Men of the sea have long known that the line between privateer and pirate was sharp in law but blurred in practice. To the merchant whose ship was seized, the commission mattered little. But among sailors, a paper sealed by a sovereign gave weight. With it, a man was a privateer, a fighter licensed for a time to strike the enemies of his nation. He took prizes. He shared the gain with his backers. He paid his tax. And if he kept within bounds, he might even win respect. The pirate, on the other hand, had no such grace. He sailed without flag or master. He struck at any ship. He kept faith only with his crew. He lived for spoils. And unless he would get hanged, he mostly lived free. A freedom some envied and others cursed. Yet, the line shilly-shallied. A man might start with a commission and end under the black flag. Some took too much or struck the wrong prey and were cast off by their own nation. Others, when states grew desperate, were pardoned for their service, as happened with the Brethren of the Coast. Claes Compaen was such a man. Born in the United Provinces, he first sailed as a privateer with Dutch papers. At the start, his ventures were lawful, and his prizes were won from enemies of the Republic. But whether from discontent or quarrels with his patrons, he slipped beyond license. And once he was cast off, he turned pirate, striking both friend and foe. His name soon spread with the other sea rovers. He plundered across the Atlantic and the African coasts. He made cause with corsairs and renegades, hiding where no law reached. And like Captain Every, he evaded capture for years, changing flags and names as it suited him. His only loyalty was to the wind and the profit it carried. But let's talk a bit of background before we jump into the full story of Claes. You see, in those years, the seas of Europe were full of men whose fates changed with their rulers' moods. The Dunkirk privateers, for instance, who were sworn to Spain, struck Dutch trade so fiercely that the States General branded them pirates. Dutch captains were told to treat Dunkirkers as criminals of the sea. The order was to give no quarter and practice Woutenspoolen, which meant casting men overboard to drown. And so in 1587, the Dutch Republic set this policy in law, forcing officers to swear an oath to drown captured Dunkirkers. This cruelty was meant to scare them off, for the Dunkirkers themselves were known to lock Dutch crews below decks and sink the ships. But many Dutch commanders, hardened though they were, would not stomach such orders. Some brought their prisoners back to port against command, and for this they were punished by their own admiralty. The Dunkirkers, in turn, kept hanging or drowning Dutchmen they caught. So revenge fed revenge until war became murder. Few wished to command ships in such times, for the sea was hazardous enough without such twisted laws. But the Dunkirkers struck far and wide, not only in the North Sea, but deep into the Baltic and the Mediterranean too. Their light frigates were quick and agile, and they outran the heavier Dutch ships, striking where they pleased. It was in 1568, when the Low Countries first rose against Spain, that the Prince of Orange began to grant commissions to private ships. These papers, issued from his small seat of power in France, carried the look of law, though Spain scorned them. Among the first to take them were the watergeuzen, or sea beggars. These were rough sailors who were driven by hate for popery and the lure of plunder. In 1572 they seized Brielle, and that bold stroke turned the course of the rebellion. To the Spaniards they were pirates wicked and plain, but to their own people they were fighters for the cause. Verily, the fall of Brielle in April first lit a spark, which led to uprisings across Holland and Zeeland. And from that came the Dutch Republic. But the sea beggars often ran to extremes. In July of that same year, 1572, they put to death 19 Catholic clerics in Brielle. They were later called the Martyrs of Gorkum simply because they held on to their faith. This act, however, although it was condemned by William of Orange, it showed the wild mix of zeal and rebellion that marked the age. The sea beggars were harsh, but their raid set the start of a new naval way. Their letters of marque made privateering a tool of rulers, blurring war and piracy for ages to come. From those waters came Claes Gerritszoon Compaen, born in Oostzaan in the year 1587. That same schoolmaster we spoke of before, who was from the same village as Claes, called him the greatest Dutch rover of all, and that was high praise, for Holland had bred many in that rough trade. Oostzaan lay near the inlet to Amsterdam. It is set among polders and canals, and it has damp land and briny air. Its people farmed, fished, dyed cloth, and sailed sloops and barges to France and the Indies. So the place knew strife for quite some time. And in the 1570s, the Spaniards fought the Goose there, burning and hanging as they went. The church at Oostzaan was wrecked by Spanish hands, and kin of Compaen may have fought in that war. So the boy was born to hunger and fire, not to peace. He grew up on tales of Spanish cruelty and Dutch defiance. By his birth, the worst had eased, but the spirit of revolt still burned in Dutch hearts. The Dutch of that age, said one writer, were quick to drink, quick to anger, and quick with knife or fist. So you now have a fairly good idea from which stock Compaen came from, and although he later sailed beyond the flags of the Republic, Compaen carried that same fierce will and edgy drive. He was not the first Dutch pirate nor the last, but he took to it with a native ease, as if the wars of his kin had steered his course before he ever saw the sea. After all, the men of the Zaanstreek were never known for peace or obedience. They lived on land won from the water, always at odds with nature and with their neighbors. It made them hard, restless, and ready to chase profit even when rule stood in the way. So it was no surprise when some stretched the meaning of their commissions, and the records of the time say as much. Lieutenant Admiral Wassenaar wrote with dismay that Dutch privateers often abused their letters of marque, and although they were sent to fight against the Spaniard, many turned their cannon on allies or neutral ships that carried rich cargo and had weak defense. The worst of them was Simon the Dancer, or Simon the Dancer in English. He was noted for his skill at sea and maybe his charm ashore. In the early 1600s, he sailed for Algiers and taught the North African corsairs to use light fore and aft rigged ships. These were faster and deadlier than the old galleys with slave benches. And so, with sharp keels and taut sails, the corsairs struck terror across the Mediterranean. Spanish towns shut their gates at the sight of Simon's pennant, but his end came by his own kind. Though Henry IV of France pardoned him and gave him guards in Marseille, his old debts caught up. Therefore, in the year 1616, the North African corsairs seized him for some past betrayal. No man knows the manner of his death, only that it was savage. And it was also said that Simon's son also turned to the sea to follow in his father's footsteps. Others too followed that same path. There was the Veenboer, who carried Dutch colours deep into the Levant. There was also Jan Jansoen of Haarlem, who had a wife and children at home, but spent his treasure in North Africa and kept a Moorish wife too. It was a time when a man might change his faith and take his pleasures as he liked, so long as he was quick enough to escape the rope. But the Veenboer in particular is quite interesting, so let me tell you a bit about him before we go back to the story of Compaen. You see, he was born Ivan Dirkie de Veenboer, and later, after converting to Islam, he was called Suleiman Reis. He rose high as admiral of the Algerian fleet in 1617, and his life showed how easy it was in those years to switch from Dutch privateer to Muslim corsair, moving between nations, creeds and loyalties as the sea allowed. As for that other fellow I mentioned, Jan Jansoen, he was known later as Murad Reis the Younger. He was yet another Dutch pirate who fell into the hands of Algerian corsairs. He too turned to Islam and rose as a corsair of high rank. He founded the Republic of Salé and served as its Grand Admiral, striking far into the Atlantic and across the Mediterranean. Anyhow, among such men, Claes Compaen would climb still higher. The schoolmaster of Oostzaan called him burgerlijk in Dutch, which meant firm, lawful, and proper in manner. Appearance-wise, he was fair-haired, well-shaped in build, and As a young man, he sailed to Guinea and beyond. There, he likely dealt in gold and in human lives, as was the common trade of those waters. And in those first voyages, he prospered. Indeed, his dealings in Guinea tied him to the Dutch trade in enslaved Africans during the early 1600s. Dutch merchants and privateers bartered goods for captives who were carried across to the Americas. As grim a commerce as it was one that brought great profit to many seafarers of that age. But calm seas never last in the Low Countries. In 1621, the 12 years' truce with Spain ended and war returned in force. The Catholic ports of Calais, Dunkirk and Ostend became strongholds of Spain's privateers. From there, they poured out to seize Dutch ships in the Channel. These Dunkirkers, whom we mentioned before, were mostly fishermen. Yet they grew so bold and many in number that the Dutch Admiralty was forced again to issue letters of marque. And in those years, the Dunkirkers took on average 229 Dutch merchant and fishing ships each year. Their raids crippled trade and pushed the Dutch Navy to strike back with privateers of their own. However, it was in the third decade of that century that Compaen, already known along the North Sea harbours, chose to seek his fortune in lawful war. He had already earned much by shady means, and now set his sights on privateering. It was a middle path between piracy and patriotism. The Republic, without doubt, was eager to wound the Spanish king's trade, and gladly gave letters of marque to men such as Compaen, who were bold enough to try. And so Compaen poured his wealth into ships under the Dutch flag, expecting fair profit. But little of that prize money reached his purse. Cargoes were often seized by officials or ruled forfeit for reasons unclear, or they were held back with claims of unlawful capture. The record is sparse, but such tricks were common in the relationship between privateer and state. So as a result, many a privateer found the Admiralty courts as deadly as a galleon's guns. But Compaen would not let the slight pass. He sought another commission, and this time he got it straight from the hand of the Prince of Orange, who was then Stadholder of Holland and Lord High Admiral. The schoolmaster later wrote that the writ also carried the seal of the States General. But this is doubtful, for in 1625 such papers came only from the prince, and it was not until after his death in 1650, when the office of Stadholder was left empty by the Republicans, that the States General claimed that power. Also by 1659, when the life of Compaen was put in print, memory of such minor details had already distorted some of the truth. But anyhow, with his commission fresh, Compaen bought a ship for the work. She was the Walter, 200 tons, armed with 17 guns and manned by 80 men. The name was known, for she had fought at the Battle of Gibraltar in 1607, when Admiral Heemskerk fell, but still crushed the Spanish fleet in their own waters. The Walter had been owned by Gerrit Peters of Medemblik, a privateer who returned from the Indies or the Spanish Main, only to stumble one night and break his neck through an open hatch. And so Compaen bought the vessel from his widow at a price that favored him well. It was the Admiralty of the North which ruled the seas from Friesland to the Zuider Zee that had first cheated Compaen of his rightful gain. You see, in the Dutch Republic, the Davy was not one, but 5 admiralties. each ruling its own waters. Each was tied in theory to the States General. But in truth, each one was serving its own hand. So they claimed to guard the coasts, keep the fleet, and judge disputes over prizes taken at sea. But sailors knew well that the boards of these admiralties were packed with regents and merchants, and they grew rich on their office. Many no longer judged fairly, but instead joined in the quarrels they were meant to settle. Compaen's case was no oddity. Many a captain saw his prize seized, condemned on weak grounds, or his share thinned by endless tricks of law. And the Admiralty of Amsterdam especially was known for its corruption. Its council seats were filled with old mayors and rich merchants who used their posts to grow their own fortunes. They rigged the auctions of seized goods so that the profits went to them instead of the sailors and privateers who had risked their lives. This theft bred mistrust as seafarers watched their spoils drained by men safe in power. At the same time, the judging of captured prizes was no better. It was meant to decide if a seizure was lawful, but in truth, it served the admiralties to take the choicest cargo under cover of law. Many captains like Compaen, who had fought hard for their prizes, were dragged into endless trials, and in the end, their claims were often denied or delayed. So such abuse drove many from privateering to piracy, seeking a life where the rewards were at least their very own. And so for Compaen, the quarrel grew personal. After denying him a fair share in his first voyage, the Admiralty now looked to profit from his second voyage. Hoping for gain, they welcomed his invitation to a farewell feast aboard his ship at Medemblik. They ate meat, drank wine, and made merry as if all were well. But at the end, Compaen handed them the bill, saying he had spent the last of his purse fitting out the ship and could not pay. They thought it was bold, but they guessed nothing more. Then, not long after he sailed away, a fisherman came to Hoorn with a letter for the Admiralty and a demand for payment for a cargo of herring. He told how, near Egmond aan Zee, his boat was stopped by Compaen. At first, he feared the dreaded Dunkirkers, but Compaen, polite enough, took his herring without coin and instead gave him a note to pass to the Admiralty. The board, in turn, laughed at the idea of honoring such a bill, but they understood the meaning. Compaen was done with them. He would serve no commission and heed no master. And so the Republic had lost another captain to the sea's free but lawless course. And many had gone the same way, casting off flag and authority when pride and profit clashed with obedience. But the taking of the fisherman's load was only a warm-up. Compaen stayed in Dutch waters 4 days before seizing a richer ship. The prize was shared among his men in the usual way. And whether the crew had been in on it from the start is unknown, for the schoolmaster leaves no word when he wrote the tale of Claes Compaen. However, when the weather forced them to anchor at Vlissingen, the men, who were fat with coin and ale, sang Compaen's name in the taverns. By this noise, word of the Walter and her daring seafaring luck spread fast. When they put out to sea again, nearly 50 new men joined them. They were drawn from the idle and the rough folk, which the town called the rabble. This number was not too many, for a pirate crew must be larger than a trader's. For a raider must fight in addition to sailing his ship. And so the more men aboard the ship, the lighter each hand's work and the stronger their threat in the eyes of the prey. In the 17th century, Dutch seafaring was long burdened with too many men chasing too few berths. As a result, the great Dutch merchant navy was a school for pirates, and no tale of sea rovers is complete without looking at the poor sailors' lot. Dutch seamen, then, even those with wives and children ashore, lived close to beggary. The Flight, which was first built in the year 1590, made things worse. For this ship had a wide hold, and it needed fewer men, and it carried no guns. And while merchants praised her, she ruined the working sailor. Now, it's worth mentioning the different reasons why men chose to become pirates. You see, the men in charge of the system want you to think it was all about plunder and greed. But there's a bigger story they'd rather you not know. They want your freedom, and they want to control you. And they've managed to do that for the past century, as you can see in how our world today is run by these neocons and elitists who lack any human qualities. So, we'll return to the story of Claes Compaen once you have a better understanding of how and why such men chose to do what they did. You see, by the year 1670, Dutch trade ships reached 508,000 tons. This was about half of all Europe's shipping. This was proof of the Flight's success at trade and its cost to seamen. With fewer jobs and wages low, owners pressed their power. Captains, knowing hunger-filled crews, gave poor food and meager pay. So men went to sea from need, and matters worsened as German and Scandinavian sailors poured into Dutch ports, swelling the total number of unemployed. This came in part because the Dutch Republic led Europe in trade, drawing in desperate men from abroad. However, only on voyages to the Indies did recruiters struggle. And even then, the trouble was death, not hardship. It was said 1 of every 2 sailors failed to return, and pay was lower than normal, giving little for such risk. Between the years 1625 and 1631, the runs to Batavia and the East Indies lost an average of 14.4% of their men, some as high as 30%. They were mostly lost to scurvy and disease. Life on a merchantman was near bondage. Orders had to be obeyed at once and without complaint. Men were sent aloft in storm and dark, and when an officer walked by, they had to stand stiff as posts, which was quite degrading for a human to do. Discipline, though perhaps needed at sea, was harsh as tyranny. Those who refused were flogged. Offenses ranged from disobedience to drink and knife fights. Even a loose tongue could earn the rope's end. In the British Navy, men were flogged with the cat-o'-nine-tails. This was a whip of 9 knotted cords. Now a sailor might take dozens of lashes, but his back would be left battered and bleeding. And to make matters worse, the whole crew was made to watch. It was a warning to them all. In the Dutch Navy of the 17th century, they used the Negenstaart, which was the 9-tailed whip, much the same as the British whip. And it too had 9 knotted cords made to cut the skin and tear out the sailor's flesh. And likewise, the flogging was done in front of the crew to punish one man and to warn the rest. Punishments at sea, though called necessary for order by the men who created the system and wished to remain in charge of it all, were often cruel. Some were lesser, like the lash, irons, bread and water, or being locked in the dark below. But some captains showed no mercy. A man might have his hand nailed to the mast for disobedience, or worse, he might face keel hauling. A man found guilty of mutiny, desertion in battle, or other grave offence was bound by ropes to the arms of the main yard. You see, keel hauling, from the Dutch word keel halen, was most feared of all. A man was tied to a rope that was run under the ship. A weight, often lead or shot, was tied to his legs to drag him down. And at the boatswain's signal he was swung aloft, dropped from the yard arm, and hauled under the ship's hull, where he is drawn from one side to the other across the keel. The hull, which was sharp with barnacles, tore his flesh in most unimaginable ways. It was not always meant to kill, though many died. But when the course ran across the beam from larboard to starboard, a man might rise again, battered but breathing. But if the order was to drag the poor victim from stem to stern, few returned alive. That longer drag brought drowning torn flesh from barnacles, or a skull dashed on rotten timbers. The practice of keel hauling was old. The ancient Greeks knew of it, and one image of the act still survives as the frontispiece to Ormrod's piracy in the ancient world from 500 BC. The first written mention, however, lies in the Lex Rhodia, which was a Byzantine sea code of roads from around 700 AD. These show that keel hauling was no new cruelty, but an old one revived in later times. And so this wicked punishment was known in the Dutch Navy of the 17th century, with records of it used even on a ship's surgeon under Admiral Jan van Ness. But by the middle of the last century, men of the sea said keel hauling was nearly forgotten. The English, however, saw it mostly as a Dutch practice. So yes, the punishment was no small matter, but only when flogging was thought too light that it was called for. It is also said that in 1673, under Admiral Tromp, a marine struck an officer during action and was keel-hauled. The log does not say if he lived, as the note was written, as plain as any entry for biscuit or powder. Either way, the Dutch prided themselves on order, and during such work they showed no sign of feeling. The officers stood still while the crew kept silent. To watch it was to see the edge where discipline became ordeal. And you know, the French had a form of punishment called la calée, which was more like ducking than a full keel haul. Pirates, too, were said to use it, though fact and fable often blur. But focusing on Dutch ships specifically, the Dutch East India Company kept many records of mutiny and execution. After the 1629 wreck of the Batavia, several mutineers were tried and hanged, with some losing their hands first. Such brutality showed how hard the law was at sea. Also, beyond punishments and the daily hardships of sailors that we spoke of earlier, there was always the issues of captains lacking in courage or conscience, cooks stealing from their rations, and clothing giving no shelter from wind or spray. So it is no wonder mutiny and riot were common. Dutch officers often claimed harsh rule was needed for their own safety, and many accounts describe Dutch sailors as quick to drink, to fight, and to defy command. For instance, in the year 1782, Balinese slaves on the VOC ship Mercure rose in violent mutiny. Armed with cutlasses and muskets, they fought European and Javanese soldiers. Such problems came from the tension within the company's mixed crews. Heck, The company's own troops and mariners were called wild swine, for they were known for theft and drunkenness abroad. Yet, what some saw as vice, others saw as an answer to long abuse, for injustice followed them ashore as well. When Piet Hein returned in 1629 with the Spanish Silver Fleet, the West India Company claimed most of the prize. We're talking about 11 million guilders in silver and goods. The Dutch state used it to fund their wars, and they gave West India Company shareholders a 50% dividend. And so, Piet Hein's crew, cheated of their reward, stormed the treasury. Bloodshed was only prevented by the armed militia. A few decades later, in 1665 at Den Briel, a crowd of sailors' families turned on Admiral Johan Evertsen after a bitter naval defeat. They called him a coward and tried to hang him in the street. Only the soldiers saved him, and those who cried for justice were sent away with nothing. So, with such things in mind, it is no wonder that many a man lost faith in lawful service. The pirate promised no comfort, but he promised to share, and for men denied even that, it was enough. It was more than enough, actually. And with that said, you now know why many men chose piracy over submitting to a rotten system that dehumanizes and degrades them to their core. True men would rather fight and die than be degraded by the likes of governments. And so, in the early 17th century, Claes Compaen chose piracy. He gathered a crew full of hard men who were eager for such work. Men who were ready to take their chance at sea. And although at first his ventures were small, soon he became a terror to all nations. Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English alike lost ships to him. He spared no flag, yet he did not kill without cause. Nevertheless, the chronicler Wassenaar wrote that Compaen's shipboardings against enemies were marked by harsh violence. His men stripped ships to their cargo, and little else was left. But when a crew yielded without fight, the pirates kept cold order, shedding no blood needlessly. This, you might say, was a kind of judgment. The better sort of pirates knew fear had value. They knew when to strike hard and when to hold back so fear would last. For instance, it was said of Bartholomew Roberts that he once had a surgeon flogged for drunkenness, yet he was merciful enough to spare an entire merchant crew. Apparently, Black Bart declared that the sea was cruel enough without needless cruelty. Anyhow, Wassenaar never gave the exact count of Compaen's captures, but he thought them very many. Maybe hundreds. In Compaen's later years, he told a fisherman of Egmond, the first man he ever robbed, that he had taken no fewer than 350 ships. And if that claim were true, and sailors often distort fact with brag, it would put him near Bart Roberts, who took about 400 ships between the years 1719 and 1722. And at his height, Compaen had 7 ships in his fleet. It was enough to strike along whole coasts. He raided Dutch and foreign shipping alike. When he cast off his allegiance, he joined a different kind of society. One without borders. One ruled by rough codes. Men of the sea know this better than landsmen. That among corsairs, there is a strange fellowship. Old hatreds die when gold is at stake. Flags of one's enemies fly together when division costs too much. For instance, the Dunkirkers who served Spain and tore at Dutch shipping, could be found alongside French and English pirates in neutral waters. Letters of marque, if carried at all, were more excuse than license. And in that world, men judged each other not by nation, but by courage, skill, and success. So, in the case of Compaen himself, he had first been sent to fight the Dunkirkers. Yet, soon after, he was welcomed in Dunkirk. That port had always been a nest of corsairs, and it cared little for papers when profit called. And one such prophet was a Dutch vessel loaded heavily and commanded by Stuart Cornelis van Soerwant, a waterlander. The ship had just come through a 3-day storm in the Channel. Her sails were torn and her crew worn down. Then, on the 4th morning, Compaen sighted her. He chased her hard for more than a tide, and when the evening wind died, he closed in. Boarding was quick, the resistance weak, and the ship was his. And so, with prize in hand, Compaen sailed for Dunkirk. He was pretty sure of himself. But then, near Calais, 4 Dutch men of war lay idle at anchor. Though they saw their country's flag now flying under pirate colours, they made no move. Whether from poor spirit, short powder, or quiet sympathy, they let him pass. Once they arrived in Dunkirk, Van Soerwant was thrown in irons, and within days, 70 more Dutch sailors joined him in jail. We know this from a boy of the crew who slipped away unseen. In the night, he slid into the sea, swam ashore, and walked an hour inland only to find the town held by Spaniards. Keeping to the shadows, he skirted past and made for Calais. He arrived there cold, spent, and near senseless, but alive to tell the tale. Compaen was no mindless brute of the sea. He knew a pirate could not fight the whole world at once. At first, he left English ships alone and spared the sails of Muslims, especially those from Salé and Safi. By this, he kept welcome in English ports and among the North Africans, who could be friend or foe, as need allowed. This also shows how piracy was tangled with trade. It was not cut apart from the world's business, but tied to it. Compaen dealt with merchants and governors as much as with sailors and gunners. The schoolmaster writes that Compaen traded often with Ireland, which was a haven for sea rovers in those times. There he made deals with men of rank, one being Willem Hall, who was thought to be William Hall, a governor of St. Clair. In 1625, Compaen went there more than once. On one visit, he entered Hall's castle, but did not trust the man's table. So he brought 80 armed men who stayed close to him night and day. Wassenaar says they followed him through the halls and chambers, never more than a step away, just as the old pirate Simon the Dancer had done in his day. And so that night, Compaen slept inside. Yet he was ringed by guards, and by morning he left for his ship and never came back. Why he broke with the English is not known, but something must have soured between them. The short peace was done, and such endings were common at sea. Trust was always thin, and bonds seldom lasted past the gain that made them. Either way. Later, Compaen set out again. He sailed with goods worth 16,000 guilders. He was bound for St. Clair, though no one knows if he reached it safely. It was a vast sum, nevertheless, far beyond the reach of a common Dutch tar, who might earn 15 guilders a month if his wages were paid at all. many who served the States General or the East India ships would sail the world and still never see so much coin as Compaen carried in one hold. But fortune turned. Compaen strayed from caution and took several English ships laden with Madeira wine, almonds, and aniseed. He stored the spoils at Plymouth, but the locals, learning the truth, gave the cargo back to the English owners. Afterward, word reached the king. Whether it was James or Charles matters little, but it was the king who ordered Compaen seized, dead or alive. And so, a squadron was sent out at once. By chance, they reached St. Clair at the same time as Compaen, who still carried his rich cargo. Luckily, he managed to escape, but the goods were seized, and his loss was hard. As a result, his anger flared. That same day, he struck 7 English ships. The plunder, by reckonings of men who knew trade, was worth 10 times what he had lost. From then on, he spared no English, Scot, or Irish ship. On land, men preached against such acts. In Ireland, those who once traded with Compaen now turned their backs. And when royal orders came for his arrest, they claimed not to know him. He was called a fugitive and outlaw, which was only a plainer name for what he already was. Still, he did not falter. Near Dublin, he met the son of the Irish admiral, who came aboard unaware of the change in fortune. The young man was fed bread, meat, and wine, but wasn't allowed to leave. Compaen saw his chance and sent an Irishman named Francois to the governor of Dublin, demanding the return of 30,000 guilders worth of goods held in the city. However, the governor refused, saying there would be no talk. Francois went back 3 times with the same reply. Yet, even when Compaen threatened to hang the admiral's son, the governor would not yield. Needless to say, Compaen, though short of supplies and known for fury, did not carry out the threat. His words, as told by his crew, were these: "Why should I kill an innocent lad? His death brings me nothing. Look how his own people care not for him, for they would see him hang rather than give me my due." It may not have been mercy so much as plain sense, but even among sea robbers, the rope is sometimes stayed. Anyhow, after sparing the youth and leaving Irish waters, Compaen went back to his old course. He continued striking ships of English, Scottish, and Irish flags, taking food and prize as he pleased. If he could not buy it, he seized it, and if men resisted, he gave no quarter. One man he marked was the Earl of Strafford, the Viceroy of Ireland. Compaen and Strafford had once been friends in trade, sharing meals and business that brought them both profit. But with the king's eye now upon him, Strafford gave orders to hunt Compaen without delay. The king's writ turned friendship to enmity, and every offer of parley was refused. So Compaen's council resolved to strike at Strafford himself. On a moonless night, his men rowed ashore in silence with pistols, cutlasses, and pikes. Their target was the Viceroy's castle, which was strong, yet not beyond surprise. But alas, some of Compaen's men betrayed the plan. As they neared the shore, the castle's guns fired and grape shot swept the water. The attack broke and the pirates fled. Yet, spying cuts both ways. If Strafford had men in Compaen's pay, Compaen had informants of his own. So soon after, fire consumed the castle. No one could prove who lit it, but most believed it was Compaen, and he made no denial. The schoolmaster later wrote that this earl was Thomas Wentworth, 1st Earl of Strafford, chief minister to Charles until his fall and execution in 1641. When word reached the Low Countries, Compaen is said to have felt the regret. Not for the burning, but for the memory of old days when they had laughed and drank as partners. Nevertheless, with his English ties cut and his name cursed in northern ports, Compaen turned south. He found new harbours in Salé and Safi on the North African coast, where rulers asked no questions if the coin was good. Salé, in particular, was a true haven. Between 1614 and 1640, corsairs ruled it as a republic in all but name, taking orders from no crown. Even the Emperor of Morocco, driven from the tribes inland, was denied entry at its gates. The schoolmaster says that while Compaen was there, the city council took 12 cannon from English traders in exchange for prisoners. Those guns were mounted on the walls against any who might threaten their rule, Christian or Muslim alike. And although he was shown welcome, Compaen stayed cautious at all times. He kept 2 ships anchored in the harbour and slept aboard each night, not trusting the moods of people whose loyalties fluctuated like the tide. However, it was said the Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Zaidan, thought well of him. Zaidan, pressed by desert tribes and hungry for allies, called Compaen Master of the Sea and gave him safe conduct. This was at Mogador, a fortress on the Atlantic coast, that Zaidan had made his seat. Compaen had sailed there with iron to sell, hoping for profit. But he never met the Sultan, for a sudden storm rose and barred the harbour. What Zaidan planned, whether to bind Compaen to his wars or drag him into the quarrels of Salé, was never known. Compaen returned to sea, and the chance was lost. Either way, at Salé, he found better ground. For, like I said, that port gave shelter and trade to men who could not show their faces in Europe. There, Compaen sold his goods and even his ships. The chief buyer was Simon the Dancer the Younger, son of the infamous dancer who had died in the year 1616. The younger dancer paid him only 1/4 of the worth of his first sale, keeping the profit for himself. Pirates often swallowed such hard bargains, for they needed powder, shot, or safe harbour more than fair price. This one time, Compaen gave up plunder valued at 85,000 guilders for only 5,000. He did so to buy the best gunpowder of the time. He did not regret it, for without arms no pirate lasts long. But when he was well supplied and not in want, he struck better bargains. It is worth noting that Compaen never sold captives into slavery, though he could have done so without risk in those waters. Instead, he freed them, setting them ashore or sending them home on passing ships bound for friendly ports. Some say this came from a Dutchman's dislike of tyranny, which, obviously, he and many other freebooters were accustomed to before they liberated themselves from the oppressive system. Others think he simply wished to be remembered kindly, even by those he robbed. Also, remember that Jan Janszoon of Haarlem we briefly mentioned earlier? That former Dutch privateer who was close to Compaen? Well, at some point, he grew rich in North Africa and sold Compaen's loot through Salé and Safi. His gains were high and he was well paid. and in time he turned renegado, leaving the Christian faith and converting to Islam. Writers like the schoolmaster called such men mamulkos, which was named after boys who were taken young in Muslim lands and raised to arms, hence the term Mamluk. Anyhow, after his turn, Jan Jansoon took the name Murad Reis. He preached the oneness of God everywhere and even urged Christian captives to abandon their father's religion and worship the one true God who has no partners, affiliates, or sons. So to the schoolmaster, Jan was worse than any Muslim born. And common talk said a renegado Christian made the fiercest enemy. And as mentioned earlier in the episode, although he still had a wife and children in Haarlem in Salé, Jan took a Muslim wife. And yes, his fortune rose fast. He was named Admiral of the Sea by the Sultan of Morocco. From tolls, pilot fees, and harbour dues, he drew great income. For a time, he held both power and wealth. But the wind changed. The Sultan lost his control and others took command in Salé. The schoolmaster spoke of an alcalde, while Mr. Drhu Wilson in his Pirate Utopias wrote of a Sufi Marabu named Al-Ayyadi who led men under jihad against Spain. And so by the year 1627, Salé had grown restless and unstable, and in this turmoil Murad lost his footing. So he turned again to piracy. And some say he went to Walidia, which was a strong port on Morocco's west coast. They say he became governor there. But the schoolmaster tells that his fall began when he worked again with Compaen, this time as a broker. At first, Compaen mistrusted him, for it is said two thieves seldom share a purse in peace. Yet their bond held, and before Compaen left Salé, he gave Murad a ship of 12 guns. It may have been a gift of respect, or simply a way to rid himself of a rival. So it may have been this same ship that carried Jan to Algiers, where he is thought to have set himself up again. The schoolmaster, however, without solid proof, ended his tale with a pious note, saying Jan came to a miserable end, as moralists often claimed, for men who lived by unlawful gain. He pointed to the 23rd part of Wassenaar's Kroniken, though that work holds only 21. The same lesson of pride and greed, undoing fortune, was told of Simon the Dancer the Younger. Like his father, he was long feared on the sea lanes. He was the first to sell Compaen's spoils in Salé, but he paid poorly, and Compaen soon found other partners. So envy and rivalry grew between them. In fact, there is a tale, told by more than one, of a quarrel between Compaen and the younger dancer. You see, Compaen, back from a voyage, heard that the dancer and another pirate planned to steal some of his plunder. Feigning no concern, he invited them to dine on his ship. And so the dancer came, and the first meal passed without trouble. But then, the next day, perhaps eager for gain, he returned with his ally. They ate again, all in good cheer, until Compaen declared he knew their plot and told them they were his prisoners. "Yield your ships," he said, "or meet me in open fight." Shocked, they refused to yield. Whether from pride or knowing pirates could expect no mercy, they ran for their ships. It seems they were trapped in the harbor, where Compaen's squadron, set in place with care, blocked their escape and may have outnumbered them. By the next day, Compaen opened fire. The dancer's ally struck his colors after a few shots, but the dancer forced his way out to sea and escaped. Even so, his honor in Salé suffered, for among corsairs, standing still mattered. Dutch records, especially Vrymans, say the younger dancer was pardoned in the year 1627 or perhaps 28. He returned to the Low Countries and went back to the more lawful trade of privateering. And since Compaen held 7 ships in his prime, a pirate fleet that size was more trouble than strength. Without lash or strict command, too many men meant mutiny. So he sold 2 ships and spread his best hands across the rest. Even so, men deserted. Some fled with a ship and its cargo, leaving him powerless. So yes, for pirates, the worst danger was not storm or shot, but their own crew. Discipline was always thin, and trust thinner still. Wassenaer and the schoolmaster both wrote that Compaen and his men kept arms always near. Even at the rest, pistols stayed loaded and muskets ready. After he quit the sea, Compaen spoke to a fisherman he once held captive. He told the man, "You grumble at your lot, but I paid dearly to snatch even a little guarded sleep, and I trusted neither stranger nor friend." If true, the words showed the weight of unlawful rule. He relied on a few watchmen who were kept loyal with good pay. But the chroniclers, Wassenaer and the schoolmaster, may have darkened the tale. The schoolmaster, fond of grand talk, compared Compaen's life to the sword of Damocles, and even to the trials of Job. Yet fear alone did not hold his crew. Most accounts say they stayed from regard. After all, he was one of the few who could bring order to freebooters. The men who had sailed long with him trusted him because he kept to the pirates' code. Spoil was shared at once upon the deck by sworn articles. So yes, where other captains cheated their crews, Compaen paid fair. And in turn, he demanded obedience. And most gave it. But as with any ship that sailed without king or company, order could wear thin when drink was plenty and tempers rose. One tale, told with relish by the schoolmaster, shows the danger. What happened was, Compaen had seized a vessel off the Spanish coast. It was laden with nearly 200 tons of Canary wine and as much sugar in chests. He later said he had caught the wolf by the ears, for once the spoil was stowed, the men set to drink. They mixed the sugar with the wine into a thick draught and drank until the deck swam with their joy. And by midnight, most of the crew were senseless. And in that stupor, 3 officers found their moment. Hendrik the boatswain, who was bitter and hungry for command, led them. They waited until Compaen went below, where he slept with 1 musket by his side and another beneath him. Then they moved among the crew, spreading rumors that the captain had grown rich while they remained poor, and that it was time to break his rule. To others, they said only that they had long labored under one man's will. Old grudges were aroused, as often happens where profit is the only bond. One need only recall the Batavia Mutiny of 1629, or the unrest under Captain Kidd, to know such tides are never far. Nevertheless, that Compaen lived through the plot shows either his prudence or the loyalty he still held. Whether feared or followed, he kept command until he himself gave it up. But again, some later mourned his leaving for they thought him a fair captain in a trade where fairness was rare. Yes, still, most of the men, too drunk to follow the plot, still raised a clamour. A handful, urged on by Hendrik, stumbled to the captain's cabin with no clear aim. Whether to seize him or to kill him, they did not know. But Compaen, ever firm and unyielding, came forth with words. He stood among them and asked with calm gravity what they wanted. Hendrik, emboldened by numbers, called for him to step down. However, Compaen threatened nothing and begged nothing. He told them he would yield if they wished it. And so, the words struck deep inside the men's hearts. A lone voice cried they would live and die with their captain. And soon, the whole deck shouted the same. Then the mood turned as quick as a squall, and the ship broke into a fight. Blades were drawn, fists were swung, and in the melee, Compaen and his loyal men drove the plotters below. The mutineers were chained, and 4 men lay dead before the noise was stilled. And what became of the traitors? A harsher captain might have hanged them or burned them with irons. Blackbeard, it was said, liked such cruelties, holding that fear bound tighter than trust. But Compaen, though no gentle hand, chose a different course. He spared their lives, keeping them in irons until they could be set ashore one by one in places where they would cause no more trouble. And as for Hendrik, the last of them, he was sent away with a few ducats, which was a strange but solid kindness. And in this way, Compaen showed himself both firm and measured, and the crew held him in greater regard. Life aboard a freebooting ship swung between feast and famine. Order was kept in food and drink unless the prize was a cargo of wine, which often ended in excess. But plenty was rare. Unlike the king's ships, pirates could not dock freely or trade in open ports. So there were long weeks of salt beef, biscuit, and foul water, and it was worse when the stores ran out. Compaen once joked bitterly that he would have traded a fine yacht for 3 small casks of peace. But you know, in such hunger, men went ashore for bread, grain, or any creature fit to eat. So these raids were little more than errands to keep alive. As the schoolmaster said, hunger is a sharp sword, and every sailor who has sailed long weeks on a pitiless sea knows it is true. On one raid ashore, Compaen's fleet came near a Spanish port. They needed food, and if trade would not serve, they would take it. So in this case, the plan was to strike the town head-on. Compaen himself led the men in the boats, but luck turned against them. The surf broke heavily on the shore, and the boats could not land. So the men leapt into the water, swimming and wading, trying to keep their powder and shot dry. And when they reached the sand, Compaen set them in what order he could. But the Spaniards had seen them coming and were ready. As a result, as the pirates pushed forward, musket and cannon fire met them. Few even came close to the walls, and so, with no guns to breach and no cover on the beach, their attack failed. And then, a sudden charge from the garrison drove them back. It was a rout. Many died on the sand. Others drowned fighting the waves to reach the boats, and less than half of the crew returned alive. Compaen, the last to leave, stayed calm even then. Being a strong swimmer, he carried the drummer who could not swim, tied to his own drum, through the breakers and onward to safety. Later, he told the tale with his usual grim humor. He said that while swimming, he saw the body of an officer lying on the seabed. The man still wore a fine gold ring, and Compaen almost turned back to take it, but he pushed on instead. "Back aboard," he called the roll. Then, bitter but half jesting, he said too few had died, for the ship still held too many mouths to feed. And so hunger had won again, and with the raid failed, the men would live on short rations and lean days at sea. So yes, the want of food was the worst trial for those who lived under the black flag. But it was not the only lack. Rope and sailcloth often cost double or triple when they could be bought at all. So again, the pirate's life swung between want and plenty. And when holds were full with plunder, the men wasted freely, gaming by day and drinking without end. And when their ships lay at anchor, often under false colors, they gave themselves over to wild liberty. By day, they bartered and traded, but once the sun went down, the decks turned to riot. Crowds of sailors and townsfolk came aboard, and the noise and lewdness lasted till dawn. Blasphemy rang from one end to the other, and as the old schoolmaster once wrote, they committed every sort of vice and uncleanness. But funny enough, in his early years as a pirate, Compaen tried to rule his crew by scripture. He kept a Bible, a book of common prayer, and the Psalms, and he used irons and chains to enforce his will. But the men, being hard and unruly as they come, cared little for holy words. So, finding both book and fetters useless, Compaen threw them overboard. In their place, he made a harsher order fit for such men. For instance, when quarrels broke out, he set the fighters in a ring and made them box before the crew. They fought till one could not rise. And if the beaten man wanted care from the surgeon, he had to pay 100 guilders in advance, or else keep his wound. Crude as it was, the method brought a kind of peace among desperate men. Aye, Compaen's rule was not like the loose democracy of some buccaneers who voted on captains and shares. His way was a rough mix of tyranny and chaos, yet it was not worse than life aboard a merchantman or a man of war, that's for sure. For though a pirate captain ruled by force, he did not claim divine right or treat his men as beasts. Save in chase or in battle, the crew were left to themselves. Therefore, what they lacked in safety, they gained in hope. A pirate's share of plunder was way richer than the poor pay of a king's sailor or a merchant hand, whose reward was often lash or drowning. So for many, the step into piracy was not far. And as I mentioned earlier, the articles of war were traded for the articles of the brethren, and though the news waited, they found a savage liberty, and at times a full belly, and again. Compaen was not quick to fight with guns and steel, but quicker to trick with words. Where other men fired broadsides, as he came on as if a friend, smooth of tongue and easy in manner, he sought to take ships with a little loss of life or sail. Consequently, many a captain, thinking him a countryman, found himself robbed without a shot fired. But when force was called for, he showed no lack of skill. His crew were hard men, known for cutlass and swivel. They fought fiercely, yet it was said they never killed outside the clash itself. Unlike crueler pirates, they did not shed blood for sport. One telling of his craft is the affair of the Omval van Hoorn, a Dutch ship under Evert Cornelis van Barcout. She lay off the Isle of May, taking in timber. Compaen came flying Dutch colours and dropped anchor nearby. He greeted Barcout and 2 other Dutch captains as kin, passing courtesies and drink from deck to deck. So, during one such meeting, with a smile and the ease of a friend, Compaen said, "What would you think if I took your ships? For I have you in my power." The others laughed, thinking it a jest, for he was their countryman, and they trusted him. Nevertheless, they parted as if in amity, never guessing the truth. But soon after, a French pirate appeared with near spent of men, most dead or gone. He could not manage his ship alone. Compaen, suspicious yet bound by the brotherhood of rovers, took him in. He meant to use the ship a while, then hand the Frenchman a smaller prize and send him off. And so, together, they planned to strike the 3 Dutch traders. They waited on the wind and tide. Meanwhile, Compaen sent men ashore to spy the Omval. They learned most of her crew were off at the salt pans, leaving her weakly manned. Seizing the chance, Compaen's men boarded her, cut her free, and sailed her nearer their own. And in the meantime, Barcout, who was still on shore, saw his ship gone and was struck with alarm. Hoping still that it was some jest, he went to Compaen to protest. But Compaen did not give the ship back. Instead, he paid him 50 ducats so he and his crew could find passage to Holland. He promised to return the Omval when he himself came home. And to his credit, he did give it back once he reached Dutch waters. But until then, he put her speed to use. In her, he took spoils worth nearly 90,000 guilders. And the French pirate who had helped him got little for his trouble. He was given no coin or share of the prize, only a small yacht and provisions. He cursed and threatened, but it came to nothing. Compaen played such tricks more than once. For instance, this one time, when driven from Ireland to the Moroccan port of Salé, he found himself short of food. So he sailed north about Ireland, then down the coast before slipping into a quiet bay. There lay a merchant ship at anchor. As before, he greeted the captain as a comrade and spoke fair words. He saw 2 fine new cannon and offered to buy them. And when the captain refused, Compaen turned to guile. His men drank with the merchant crew in the taverns until they were senseless. And while the sailors lay drunk ashore, Compaen's men cut the merchant's boats and took the ship. He kept the cannon and the cargo. But later he gave back the hull and most of the provisions, which was a strange mix of theft and courtesy. But in time, his craft began to betray him. Word of his tricks spread through the ports. Fewer captains trusted his colours. Fewer gave him parley. And so, even among pirates, his name proved to be a blade with 2 edges. And this other time, also in the port of Salé, lay a Frisian ship under Captain Auke Douwes. She was strong and carried 14 bombards, but it barely had any crew aboard worthy enough to defend the ship. And so, Compaen came into the harbour. He cast his eye on Douwes' ship and thought first to attack. But then he chose a craftier way. He sent word asking Douwes to come aboard his vessel. Yet, by now Compaen's name had become too dark with treachery for any man to trust him. As a result, Douwes, no fool, refused the call. When told of it, Compaen only said with scorn, "None trust a knave." Indeed, Compaen could plot. But he could also strike hard when needed. He bore a deep hatred for Spain, though he had cast off his own country. And the Spaniards hated him just as much, for they hunted him without rest. One of them was Colaert, a Flemish seaman who later led the Dunkirkers against Dutch trade. In the year 1637, he was beaten by the Zealand fleet. But before that, he got word Compaen was off the coast of Castile. So he sailed from St. Lucas with 4 strong ships that were well armed and tightly manned. He caught Compaen near the coast. He closed in and forced him to a fight. The first clash went against Compaen. His men, though hardened freebooters, were pressed hard. But with the fury of men who had no home but the sea, they fought through. They broke the line and slipped out to open water. However, it was not the last time Compaen escaped by the speed of his seamanship. For nearly 3 years he lived in that way, raiding, running and fighting. At length he felt the weight of his years. By this time he had gathered enough treasure to live well ashore if he wished, and so, like many before him, he turned his mind to pardon. As you know already, governments back then often forgave those pirates whom they could not seize or hang. And the Dutch states had already been petitioned on his behalf by a man named Colaert. This Colaert had sailed on a Spanish ship that was taken by a Scottish rover. He was carried to an Irish port where he met Compaen. This meeting came before the Irish authorities declared their enmity against Compaen. Colaert later said that Compaen was heavy with riches, and that his arms and throat were dripping with gold, and that his pockets were full of ducats. And now, Compaen was close to 40, which was old for a sea thief. But he had a wife and children still in Holland, so maybe that is another reason why he decided to call quits. Nevertheless, his crew was more than 100 strong. Hard men who looked more like devils than sailors. He warned that, if the Dutch would not pardon him, he would take service with the Ottomans, as Jan Chansoon had done before him when he turned corsair and struck at Christendom. Either way, Colaert gave word to the state of Holland that Compaen had caused great harm to Dutch trade. He told how Compaen harried their ships and broke the commerce of the Republic so badly that no ordinary measure could stop him. He judged that only a pardon would bring peace. And so the Dutch states, either moved by his words or tired of the cost and danger of chasing Compaen, chose to grant it. They sent Hein Arts to deliver the pardon. He was said to be Compaen's half-brother through their mother. However, the errand failed, for Hein never found him. Compaen, slippery as ever, kept out of reach. And before the pardon could be set in his hands, he crossed the Dutch again. This time with Admiral Wybrant Schram of the East India Company. We are lucky to know the fight in detail, for the Admiral's own logbook from his voyage to the east was later printed in Amsterdam. Both Wassenaar and the schoolmaster leaned on this log, and the latter copied much of it whole, so that a third of his book tells of Compaen's battle. So what happened was, on May 3rd, 1626, Schram sailed with 9 company ships bound east. By May 30th, his yacht Hollandia began to leak, and so the fleet divided, with the faster ships pressing on, while the Hollandia and the yacht Grutenbroek turned towards Sierra Leone for repairs. Then, on July 4th, They reached the coast, but could not enter the harbour because of the tide and shoals. Then, at dawn the next day, they spied 4 sails heading to the same waters. Not knowing if they were merchants or men of war, friends or foes, Schram made ready to fight. The crew worked fast. Furniture and stores were stowed below into the soldiers' berth. 70 tons of beer and fresh water were tied to the deck with holes bored so they could be thrown overboard for speed if need be. Gun ports were opened, cannon run out, and soldiers called to their posts with arms in hand. And when the strange ships came near, they raised the flag of the Prince of Orange, which was a trick often used by sea rovers until the moment they struck. But their gun ports were open, their men at the guns, and on their decks flew a red ensign, the rude Shant Cleiden, which every sailor knew meant no quarter. One ship drew close enough for Schram to hail her, asking whence she came. From the sea, was the short reply. It was none other than Compaen. And so, with odd politeness, he said he awaited word of his pardon. The ships traded salutes, and then Compaen rejoined his squadron and raised the red flag in earnest. That flag left no doubt, for it was the mark of a pirate, not a privateer. It showed a man who no longer bargained with mercy. And so, as Compaen's squadron bore down on the Hollandia, Schram hailed the lead vessel, and with dry wit, he said that he already knew the worth of Compaen's goodwill. Then he ordered fire without delay. The soldiers loosed a musket volley that struck accurately and drove the pirates below decks. Compaen, standing on the poop with sword in hand, was shot in the arm and fell flat. He had planned to board the Hollandia and then take the Grutenbroek, which hung astern, as an easy prize. But, wounded and beaten back, he changed course and opened a distant cannonade instead. Schram then pressed hard under full sail, closing in and firing muskets until Compaen was forced to shut his ports. One of Compaen's ships, his vice-admiral, began to leak and had to fall off to leeward. The battle lasted 4 hours, from noon until the 4th bell of the afternoon. And then, at last, seeing he could not master the Hollandia, Compaen turned on the Grutenbroek. But Schram gave chase again, so he seized the wind and drove him onto the shoals. In 6 fathoms, the pirates dropped anchor, and in 8 fathoms, Schram cast his own. The fight left its mark. Schram counted 6 wounded, of which 4 died. The worst was the ship's preacher, who lost a leg and soon died after the cut. His wife, who had sailed with him, was torn apart, losing both legs and part of her body. She died on the 8th of July. As for the head carpenter and 1 soldier, both were badly hurt. They too died in the days after. Only a sergeant and a midshipman lived on, their wounds less grave. The pirates, however, lost more. 17 were killed, and as many wounded, with Compaen himself among the hurt. And in the end, measured against the odds, Schram's losses were light. The Hollandia carried 450 men. Schram showed both perseverance and care in the fight. Compaen, on the other hand, had fewer hands. No more than 115 or 120. But his strength lay in his guns. His 4 ships bore 44, 26, 24 and 12 pieces. a hard wait for any freebooter. The Hollandia, however, had only 26 guns, and the Grotenbroek had only 14. On the 6th of July, after the fight, Compaen's squadron sailed into the harbour. His ships were worn, but he's still afloat. Thereafter, they anchored there. Schram, more battered, spent 3 days patching up before he could follow. By the 9th of July, his ships were near ready, and on the morning of the 10th, he stood in the same harbour. The pirates, however, stayed at their moorings and did not move. Now, the game changed. Compaen, seeing that force would not serve him, turned to trickery. He sent 2 African men from the Guinea coast, likely from Sierra Leone, in a canoe with a letter for Schram. The words sounded meek, though no man trusted them. Compaen begged pardon for the fight, spoke of making peace, and even offered to trade letters as friends. He asked to buy provisions, promising to pay twice the going price, and he asked for news of the pardon. The one he hinted had been offered, or at least wished for earlier. And so, to excuse his attack on Schram's ships, Compaen blamed 3 Dutch officers who had sailed with him from Holland. He said they lost their purses at the gaming table and, desperate, forced him to take prizes he would have spared. And to show the virtue he claimed to keep, he told of a fight against the Spaniard Colaert, since Spain and the Dutch Republic were still enemies. He also said he sought dealings only with fellow Christians, as he otherwise traded with heathens and Mahometans. The schoolmaster, commenting sharply on Compaen's letter, said, "See how a beaten cur wags its tail." He also added that the plan had been Compaen's own, and that the pirate himself had pointed to Schram's ship and said, "She sails for the Indies and carries no less than 8 chests of treasure." Schram, though no keener for more fighting than Compaen, answered with more honesty. In his reply, he spoke regret for what had passed, and noted that many in his own crew had kin among the pirates. A son his father, as he put it. And so Schram agreed to meet and perhaps keep the peace, but he told Compaen to move his ships farther off so he might sail safely into the trade winds. Compaen, however, would not yield. He then tried another play. He sent his master, Jan Simons Struys, with 6 others, all dressed in fine clothes, which was a show unfit for men who lived by plunder. Schram kept to his demand, but Struys, whether it was because he was careless or lazy, did not hurry back. He stayed on the Hollandia all afternoon, drank plenty, and laughed roughly with the crew. Later on, at last, it stumbled back to his own ship, all drunk and senseless. Then, on the 11th of July, more letters passed between the commanders. They did Compaen no good, however. His words, now begging, now proud, found no trust in Schram, who gave nothing away. And by the evening of the 12th, Compaen raised anchor. It turns out that one of his ships had taken too much water in the previous fight and was judged unfit. So she was stripped of iron and powder, then run aground. Her crew was scattered among the other ships, and Compaen set anchor again 1/2 mile off. This gave Schram a narrow way to the sea, yet the pirates lay so close that with fair wind and current they could reach him in 1/2 an hour. So Schram stayed on guard. His men kept their posts with matches burning and arms ready, while the carpenters still mended the damage. Lemons were brought aboard to ward off the scurvy that dogs long voyages, especially in hot seas where meat rots quickly and water runs foul. And on the 19th of July, Schram made his departure. As his ship sailed out, Compaen fired his great guns. Whether in salute or in threat, no man could say. Yet, Compaen still hoped for gain. Then, on the 21st of July, foul weather struck, and the Hollandia lost sight of her consort. The Groten broke. So Compaen seized the chance and bore down on the Hollandia the next day. But, seeing Schram's men well set and ordered, the pirates sheered off without fight. The schoolmaster wrote with bitter humour. Why does he call himself Neptune and master of the sea? Is it true, as he boasts, that he once passed through a fleet of 30 Dutch and English in the Channel, who all fled before him, save the 2 he took as prizes? Compaen then turned to the Grutenbroek, thinking her weaker. He won the weather gauge, which was the better position in battle. But before he could fire, the Hollandia appeared again. Schram drove straight for the pirates. At this bold move, Compaen broke off the chase and stood away. And so, after being outsmarted by Schram, Compaen then turned north. On the way, he took a merchant ship returning from Guinea. The vessel belonged to Jacob Quick of Oostzaan, who hailed from Compaen's own birthplace. Some say this may have been the same ship later given to Jan Janzoon, though it is not certain. And now Compaen sailed again for Salé, rich with plunder. There he learned his long-awaited pardon had come. It was brought by Abram Valkenburg, who came with Evert van Barkhout, who was once master of the Omval van Hoorn, a ship now in pirate hands. Both men had waited months in Salé, living at Jan's house for Compaen's return. In time, they were joined by Hein, Compaen's brother, who told him the pardon was extended, but only if he appeared by a fixed date. So upon hearing this, Compaen chose to go home. He sold his loot, which was worth near 50,000 guilders, though the alcalde of Salé still owed him a share. So without revealing his plan, Compaen invited the alcalde to dine aboard. After the meal, he declared he was sailing and would carry the alcalde off unless the debt was paid. Thereafter, the alcalde sent for coin. But it turned out to be fake silver, base and worthless. Angered, Compaen threw the pieces out the window. Most sank, though a few fell into the boat below and were pocketed by the crew. And now, Compaen held the alcalde until genuine coin was brought, which was at last done. And just when Compaen thought he had rid himself of this problem, as the ship prepared to leave, a new trouble arose. A Jewish merchant came aboard with a Dutch captive in chains. The prisoner was kin to one of Compaen's men, and his ransom was being bargained. Compaen flew into rage, swearing no man on his ship would wear chains or be treated as cargo. And when the merchant protested, Compaen shouted, "Shall I be moved by one who denies Christ? Cast the dog overboard." 2 crewmen obeyed, and so they threw him into the sea. By fortune, boatmen nearby pulled him out alive and carried him ashore. And now, finally, Compaen turned his course for Holland, thinking faintly of an orderly life. With him were Valkenburg, Barkhout, and his brother Hein. On their first evening in the cabin, the 3 guests removed their hats and began to pray before the meal. Compaen, already eating, looked up and asked what they were about. When told, he answered wryly, "There is no cause to thank God. He has not set foot on this ship these 2 years." As you remember what I said earlier, it was said that Compaen had thrown all his religious books into the sea 2 years before, either in anger or disillusion. The schoolmaster, who later wrote the tale, called it proof of a hardened soul, without reverence or fear. He judged such men lived as though no god ruled above, a charge often laid upon sea rovers, and not always wrongly. Anyhow, not long after, Compaen showed that the old life still tugged at him. Near the Strait of Gibraltar, his fleet met 2 Dutch ships. Men from those vessels came aboard and offered to help seize them in exchange for a share. The officers of Compaen's crew thought well of it and put the plan before him. However, tempted though he was, Compaen knew it would break the pardon he had just gained. So, he called the crew together and told them plainly that if they took the ships, all would share the risk. The men, showing rare respect, said they would follow his judgment. It was clear they still feared the shore life, yet they had grown weary too of the endless gist of outlawry. Compaen, nevertheless, seemed ready to take the offer. Perhaps his blood still urged him, or he could not yet see himself as a man of peace. He might have turned back to piracy had not Barkout stepped in. With tears, Barkout begged him not to waste the long struggle for his pardon and safe return. More than that, he brought word that struck deep, that Admiral Lawrence Reale and a Dutch squadron had come to hunt him. And as it turns out, Admiral Reale's ships reached Salé only 4 days after Compaen left. So that warning told the tale plainly. The hunter was near, and the rope not far. Thus, Compaen weighed the odds and chose not to risk it. He left the merchant ships untouched and turned for Holland. On Ireland's west coast, Compaen's men went ashore for supplies. They took bread, dried fish, salt beef, and all that seamen need. They also brought aboard a crowd of women who were lured by silver chains, rings, and pieces of 8. The crew indeed spent freely, and the women did not leave until the men were fully satisfied. And in the midst of all this, Barkout, who was sober, urged Compaen not to delay. The pardon was running short and the days were nearly gone. Afterward, the order came to raise anchor. The women were rowed ashore as their part in the voyage was done. What followed showed the rough humor of a crew long unchecked. You see, when they came ashore, many of the pirates turned cruel. Laughing and jeering, they robbed the women of their coin, tore their clothes, and drove them screaming across the sand. Only one woman escaped. She was Compaen's own consort. And on Barkout's advice, she avoided the boats and left the ship by water instead. When Compaen heard she was safe, he was glad, saying he would not have borne it well had she been treated as the others. So even a rogue, it seems, may spare cruelty for one he holds dear. But in Compaen's case, we saw it plenty of times, since he wasn't cruel at all, unless it was necessary. Soon after, while Compaen still sailed near Ireland, a man named Jan Quenoy brought word of a 14-day extension to his pardon. It was a narrow thing, for without it, his time would have run out. And by the time he reached the Dutch coast and turned into the Vlie, he had only 4 days left. Once he arrived there, he sent a fast boat to Medemblik to fetch the pardon papers. Here, the schoolmaster explains Barkhout's true purpose. You see, Compaen's flagship was no longer the Walter, but a finer ship, the Omval van Hoorn, which he had taken from Barkhout himself. That vessel, worth 22,000 guilders, belonged to Jan Dirks Doigt, a powerful merchant. And so, it was Doigt who had interceded to win Compaen's pardon. Barkhout had sailed with him as Doigt's agent, charged with regaining both ship and master. And in the end, Compaen kept his word. He returned the Omval van Hoorn, along with 2 other ships he had held. Even the 9 cannons taken from Peter Everts were restored. And so it was that a sea rover long at odds with law was allowed to come ashore alive, with some honor left, though not without shame behind him. At the Vlaai, Compaen left his fleet and slipped quietly to the town of Vianen. There he hid, waiting for his pardon to be set in full. He did not move until the document was in hand, for sailors know not to trust the word of a statesman. And once it was confirmed, Compaen went to The Hague, which was the seat of the States General and home of the Prince of Orange. There it was custom for one who sought mercy to show himself with due form and submission. Compaen did not forget his manners. He offered the prince a gift of gold, taken no doubt from his unlawful gains. But the prince refused, saying he would not let pirate treasure stain his hands. But those around him were less proud, and many nobles and officials begged and flattered Compaen, hoping for a share. Funny enough, as it is well known, though seldom said, that men will curse piracy while reaching for its spoils. And so Compaen stayed in The Hague only a short while. With caution, he left the court and went by barge to Hoestzaan with a strong guard of his old crew. The schoolmaster was there to see it. The sight of that famed rover, dressed in rich foreign clothes, surrounded by followers and welcomed with awe and unease by his neighbors, was something rare in that quiet village. But even at home, Compaen stayed cautious. He always kept 3 men close. Willem de Vissa, who had been with him from the start, Age, a Frisian who had served as his watchman and personal hand, and a Frenchman whose name the schoolmaster does not record. Age did not live long after their return, but before he died, the schoolmaster taught him to write, likely the only learning the man ever had. And as you'd expect, Compaen's house was always armed. 2 pistols loaded and ready stood by the door. The schoolmaster believed Compaen feared betrayal or theft, but there is reason to think so. Yet he did not live as a man ruled by fear, for he was often seen walking alone in the lanes behind the church, dressed in foreign garb that drew every eye, and these walks became part of village life. And every time he came back, he often passed through the schoolmaster's classroom. On those visits, not one child looked up, whether from discipline or unease, or both. The schoolmaster tells us Compaen was then near 40, tall and strong, with a face both bold and commanding. He spoke carefully and clearly, yet he seldom spoke of his life at sea. That silence may have been from caution, or shame, or simply a weariness with old tales. But his past hung on to him like salt on a coat, seen even when not spoken. When Claes Compaen at last returned to Oostzaan, he lived more than 30 years without note. He left off trade and never sailed again in more than a skiff. Most days he'll fish the inland waters. It was a simple task that gave him cover and kept strangers at bay. Still, visitors came. Some were friends, like a Portuguese who embraced him as a brother long lost. Others came with old debts, like a fisherman from Egmond, whose ship Compaen had once taken. That man apparently found Compaen's house and asked for repayment. And Compaen, hearing his plea, left at once, muttering of other business. Compaen's wife, however, kinder than he, gave the fellow wine and 4 gold pieces. But the grumpy fisherman stayed, hoping for more. And when Compaen returned, he asked what had been given. On seeing the coins, he pocketed them without a word and offered no more kindness. But unwilling to drive the man out, he told him to come along to Zaandam with the household. So they set off, with Compaen dressed in scarlet, with silver at his collar, pistols on his belt, and likely a blade at his side. On the road, the fishermen spoke of storms, poor catches, and the dangers of the sea. Compaen answered in a calm voice, insisting that the life of a sea rover was worse. He said that he was never safe, and that he feared his own crew as much as any enemy, and that he always slept with weapons at hand. He also said that he often longed for a quiet home and a small purse of 3,000 or 4,000 guilders, and had life gone another way, he would have served as a cavalryman for the Prince of Orange rather than sail as a pirate again. Now, whether Compaen spoke from regret or passing fancy is not known. Men who curse danger while living it often miss it when it is gone, and men who stay too long ashore often long for the sea again. So it may be that Compaen, though weary, still missed its fierce clarity while claiming to despise it. Either way, the fisherman seemed struck, never thinking a pirate's life held more dread than daring. He looked on Compaen with a kind of amazement. Meanwhile, when they reached Zaandam, they went to a tavern and were joined by Jacob de Grael, the secretary of Oostzaan. That such a man sat with Compaen showed that though the town knew his past, it did not wholly cast him out. After all, time dulls infamy, and a man once feared may later be treated with tolerance if he keeps the peace and pays his way. Later, when the fisherman asked again for payment, Compaen at last replied. He asked what share of the cargo had been the fisherman's, since the vessel had not belonged to him. Then he shrugged and said he cared nothing for shipmasters or owners, nor for the 350 ships he had once taken. He would meet any of them without shame or apology. And in the end, Compaen promised the man a token gift on his next visit. It was an easy pledge made over wine. And so the talk turned to drinking and laughter. Compaen, smiling wryly, asked what the fisherman would have done had his ship and all her lading been lost. The fisherman, warmed by drink, said he would have stayed with Compaen and shared in the spoils. But in truth, such words are easy over a jug, though few could prove them true in action. I'm sure we can all relate to that, no? Anyhow, the tale closes with the village schoolmaster, who wrote that Compaen, now 70 years old, had fallen on lean times. His son Jan and his half-brother Hein were both lost to the sea. And so, The schoolmaster offered this as a lesson, as proof of the futility of the pirate's way. Yet, even this telling cannot be taken without doubt. It's interesting enough that, in the year 1658, Soeteboom wrote a history of the Zaanstreek, when Compaen was aged 71 and close to death, and he made absolutely no mention of poverty. The people of Oostzaan themselves did not all say he died poor. Even in the modern era, during the 1930s, talk of Compaen's hidden treasure sent villagers digging for gold that was never there. So, what are we to make of his retreat from piracy? By law, he had been an outlaw, yet he slid back into village life with ease. And as told before, in Oostzaan, he was welcomed not as a man seeking pardon, but simply as a neighbor come home. So again, the mark of piracy did not cling to him long. This may tell us that in those days property was not held so sacred, and that law had not sunk deep into common life. Trade and plunder were not so far apart in aim. And it's worth mentioning yet again that since Compaen shed little blood, he used cunning more than cannon, and was said to treat captives with rare mercy. So, he was spared the worst of infamy. Where others swung from the rope, he ate at the table. Where others were cursed, he was borne with, even toasted. It is not for us to judge. We only ought to see what the times allowed and what they chose to overlook. The schoolmaster's tale matches what Nicolaas Wassenaer wrote in his history. The schoolmaster's words, however, show he felt two ways about the pirate. He could not praise a man who turned outlaw against Christian order and Dutch law. Yet he could not help but marvel at Compaen's daring life at sea. After all, the pirate's bold command stood far apart from the quiet ink and scripture of the classroom. The book was printed in more than one edition and spread through the Dutch Republic. It was set in heavy Gothic letters and was most popular with common folk. They simply loved the tales of bold sailors who stood against authority. Again, the schoolmaster had trouble getting the best stories, though. Compaen kept his silence and would not speak of his past. Even Soeteboom, the bookseller, who wrote of the region, failed to get him to talk. Still, the schoolmaster looked elsewhere. He used the writings of those who had seen Compaen at sea, either as foes or as witnesses. And one such source was the aforementioned Nicolaas Wassenaer of Amsterdam. His chronicle was printed in the year 1628. It covered events from the year before, including Compaen's return. Wassenaer, on the other hand, wrote much about Compaen's piracy. He even noted that Compaen himself had once agreed the tale was true when speaking to his old neighbor Jan Wechters, and so the schoolmaster leaned on Wassenaer's record when making his own book. Wassenaer told of Compaen's raids on the coasts of Europe and Africa. He spoke of his fights with different nations and his ventures in the Mediterranean. These stories showed how wide Compaen's reach had been, and how much he had influenced trade and war upon the seas. Another main source for the tale is the Sea Journal of Admiral Wybrant Schram, which was written in 1626. About a third of the old pamphlet comes straight from his hand. In it, Schram tells of his clash with Compaen's squadron, which, if you recall, was also one of the notorious pirates' last big fights. but the journal was not printed until 1650. However, copies of it were already being passed around. Wassenaer himself seems to have had one when he wrote his own account. Schram's story spread and made Compaen's name even darker and more feared. His pages were filled with sharp detail of cannon fire and ship turns. It gave later readers a true look at sea fights of that age, for they add much to our picture of Dutch wars and sea ventures in the Golden Age. But the retelling here is not quite the same as the schoolmaster's. The schoolmaster wished to draw out a lesson for order and obedience. At the same time, a later reader may wonder if Compaen's course was not entirely about greed and chance, but a kind of defiance. Yes, like I said before, his men, as tough and ruthless as they were bound to no country, and they may have sought freedom and liberty as much as the plunder that we assume they craved. So perhaps, when they cut themselves loose from home and law, they were reaching for a life outside the rule that had little place for them. And this is not just my personal thoughts or speculations. Some folks on shore, and a few wild writers too, liked to say that pirates were rebels against the world's order. Man is meant to be free. Our world order is an unjust, oppressive constraint to all manner of man's liberties. And just so you know, that idea first took root in the year 1724, when a man calling himself Captain Charles Johnson printed his book about the most notorious pirates. No one knows who Johnson really was, and much of his book is filled with tales he made up. But it caught fire with the readers of his day. And in that book, he told of Captain James Misson, a Frenchman who was said to have left his homeland's unfair ways and built a new life in Madagascar. They called his settlement Libertalia, where all men were equal and wealth was shared, with no church or king above them. As of today, no chart marks this place, and it is believed to be no more than a sailor's yarn yet. The story still remains as a dream of freedom on the sea, and from that story came the fancy of the pirate as a sea-born Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and winning love from the poor. But this picture is far from true, for real pirate life was filled with beatings, hunger, and harsh rule, as we've clearly seen since the beginning of this episode. Not the cheer of song and stage. However, more important was the nature of the men themselves, be they Christian or Muslim or whatever. They had no taste for kings or pashas giving orders. They had felt the lash and hated it. In the West Indies, or as they say, the New World, the chains were looser, and a man could steer by his own compass. The Caribbean was full of islands and weakly held lands where such men could live by their own law. Spanish fleets and settlements offered rich plunder, and there was little central power to stop them. So many who had been privateers or corsairs turned themselves into buccaneers in the New World. And while Salé was once a brotherhood for outcasts and sea rogues, it fell apart in 1641 when the Al-Zawiya al-Dilaya, a strong Sufi order, took control of Morocco. And so their rule ended Salé's freedom, and with it, the notorious Corsair Republic. No one can say for sure if this drove men west. But when North Africa shut its doors, the Caribbean opened them. And of course, We know more about these crossings in the later 17th century than in the early years. That is because some men wrote down what they saw. For instance, William Dampier, an Englishman of sharp eye, sailed the world 4 times and kept careful journals. He wrote of his voyages and of the creatures and lands he found. Then there was Jean-Baptiste Labat, or more commonly known as Père Labat. He was a French priest who sailed with buccaneers. He set down his bare story of life in the islands. He wrote of the people, plants, beasts, and the buccaneers themselves. There was also Raveneau de Lussan, a French pirate with no set trade. He left his tale behind too. So did Basil Ringrosse, a learned English buccaneer who drew charts and maps of the Pacific coast. His work still guides us in knowing that shore as it was in the age of the buccaneers. But it is one man who fixed the picture of the Caribbean pirate more than any other. You see, in the year 1678, a book was printed in Amsterdam called De Amerikaanse Zeerovers. In English, it became known as The History of the Buccaneers. And what a fabulous book it is. Highly recommended. It was written by Alexander Olivier Exquemelin, a French barber surgeon. He was born around 1645 and served as a surgeon among the buccaneers. Later he settled and worked in the Dutch Republic. But he did not leave the sea behind. In the year 1697, he was at Cartagena as a surgeon during the French attack led by Baron de Pointes. That raid was part of the War of the Grand Alliance, which brought the French both victory and plunder. Exquemelin's part in it showed he was still tied to war at sea. And so, his book has shaped the way we picture pirates ever since. From him, we hear of François l'Olonnais, ever cruel and feared. From him, we get the wrecking of Spanish galleons. From him, we know of Captain Morgan's raid on Panama that shook the Spanish main. So it was, from Algiers to Tortuga, from Salé to Port Royal, sailors lived by chance more than by flag. They followed the winds, the powder, and the tides. If a man turned pirate, it was not so much a fall as a change in the weather. However, one question has been stuck in my head since the start of this episode, and I can't seem to shake it. Did Claes Compaen have his own adventures in the Caribbean too? We certainly don't know much about most of his wild escapades, so for all we know, I may have sailed to the West Indies, and perhaps even farther.